Hi, my name is Steve Ehrman. I'm recording this session for the University of Tennessee Knoxville's conference on innovative teaching and learning. And the subject, creating a context for the continual improvement of teaching and learning. And while we're at it, equitable access and affordability. First thing I want to say about these goals, institution level goals of improving quality, equity of access and affordability, is that all three of them are urgent. I was struck in the course of my work to see research, a lot of which had been collected by the American Association of Colleges and Universities. Sorry. That when faculty evaluate the work of students at other institutions, double blind, they don't know anything about who the students are, including they don't know whether they're freshmen or sophomores or fourth year students, and don't know which institution they are at. And they evaluate the work, they assess the students' work using rubrics for judging the degree to which students have made progress on certain essential learning outcomes, that the faculty generally find that most of the students in their final year at a 2-year or 4-year program are not performing at that level. And second, employers talking about what's happening with new hires have some of the same dissatisfactions that faculty do. So for me, this is enough because the gap is so big between expectation and reality that improving the quality of learning at an institution is more important and especially more urgent than a lot of people think. I think a lot of people would look at this list of 3 goals and give priority to equity of access, affordability, or quite likely both, but would see quality as well. Can always be better, but we're okay enough. I don't think so. The research behind this claim is what occupies chapter 1 of my book, Pursuing Quality, Access, and Affordability. If you go to the bit.ly link, that's the Stylus Publishing's website for the book and reviews of it and so on. There's a link to chapter 1. It's available free online, and that's where this research is summarized. So I got into this and I asked myself 3 questions, basically. Enlarge my beautiful face for you. Is it possible for institutions to make gains on all 3 fronts simultaneously? And the way I proposed to answer that was to find one or more that had done it. Second, and I found more than 6, I eventually ended up writing about 6 of them. Do their current practices suggest how other institutions could make threefold gains? In other words, what do you need to be able to do? How do you need to be organizing academic work in order to make threefold gains? And the third, and in some ways the most important part, I looked at the history of these institutions going back 10 to 20 years to try to find out how their journeys to developing this capacity got started. And what were they doing during that period of time that's enabled them to be performing as well as they are today. I looked at these 6 institutions, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the first and the last of them. Georgia State, 2003. A situation that people at Georgia State were increasingly dissatisfied with, some ashamed of. Only 32% of their white students, still worse, only 26% of their African-American students who entered Georgia State in 1997 had earned a bachelor's degree from Georgia State within the next 6 years. And it was worse than that. You can read the rest of the slide yourself, and we're talking about a big institution. And this is how they did it. This is maybe the single most important slide in this presentation. Over on the left, this is graduation rates, 20% at the bottom, 60% at the top. Graduation rates of students who entered Georgia State and then graduated from Georgia State with a bachelor's degree within 6 years. So they started doing something about that problem. One of the first things that was done was to instigate and then widen the use of freshman learning communities till they become almost universal. A year later, they were scaling up the practice of supplemental instruction. A year after that, they began redesigning the math courses with the highest rates of failure and made them much more digital, in a word, with students learning in a specially developed facility that at Georgia State they call MILE, which is basically a room that's set up with computers around tables in ways that encourage students to ask each other for advice or talk about things. And they also make it easy to signal that they want help from a wandering graduate student or the faculty member who spent some time circulating in the room to answer student questions. Another key point, we're going to come back to that. 2008, they established an Office of Student Success, the aim of which was to coordinate more of the efforts that each in their different ways had effects on student success, student access, and student success. And each year, not all the interventions are here, but every year or two, there were one or two new initiatives. Now, what I want to point out, because it's crucial to the fact that this all works, is that these initiatives were all chosen because they were sustainable at scale. In other words, they were putting base budget money into these, and they felt that they could be expanded as much as needed and still stay within financial realities of Georgia State. Not every single one is infinitely expandable. Those MILE classrooms are a little on the expensive side and requires renovation. So that's not available for everybody who wants one. And there's a summer academy, which is not here, for students who are from at-risk groups that can handle some hundreds of students. But last time I checked, which was a couple of years ago, they didn't yet have the funding to handle all the students who were eligible and interested in doing that. And all the time as these innovations are being added to each other, one after another, so that all of them are in operation 2019, now the overall graduation rate is 55%. So to summarize what they've been able to achieve, in 2003, 32% of Caucasian students, which given that number must have meant that it was a very large number of Caucasian students there, were graduating from GSU in 6 years. 26% of African Americans were able to do it, and only 22% of Latin American students were able to do it. Flash forward 16 years, Caucasian students graduating from Georgia State, 50% of those who entered 6 years earlier, 58% of the African American students who had entered 6 years earlier, 57% of the Latin American students, the Hispanic students. 2019 looked at a different way. By 2019, the feds are making data available so that you can see of your entering class 6 years earlier, what percentage of the entering students have earned a BA from somewhere, if not Georgia State, then some other institution. And looked at this way, there basically is no gap. The students who may have started off in one way or another from behind are graduating about the same rate as everybody else, except Latin American students who are doing even a little better. So what I skimmed over on that chart actually was a constellation, I'll call it, of interventions three kinds, in fact, and the first kind is educational strategies. As I mentioned, each of these is, I didn't say this, but each of them was quite focused on solving a particular problem. Each was sustainable at scale. And here are some examples of them. High impact, they're using a lot of these high impact practices. The math courses taught in the MILE facility, and now courses in other disciplines too taught in such facilities, have been redesigned in ways that are intended to improve the quality of learning and also the pass rates in those courses. Meta majors were instituted to help assure that when students chose to change majors, even relatively later in the game, that they would still be able to graduate within 6 years or sooner. I mentioned the Summer Bridge Academy. They've also instituted learning pathways for students to cumulatively learn what they need and to be able to see further earlier in their time at Georgia State why they're learning the things that they're doing. And ePortfolios are an important part of this overall college to career program. So how does this work? High impact practices can improve learning for all, especially useful for students from underserved groups. That was already shown to be true at other institutions, not just at Georgia State. What I learned from the folks at Georgia State was that just by doing this, you also get affordability gains. And that's because students don't need to take courses twice or 3 times or more as often, so they don't need to be taught as much. And retention is improved, graduation rates are improved. So students are getting the economic returns of a college education sooner in their lives, while spending less time and money to get that get to graduation. Students save time and money. The institution saves money and time in teaching them, and the gains in retention and the gains in graduation rates also increase the total tuition revenue. Georgia State has calculated that they earn more than $3 million for every percentage point gain in graduation rates. So if they were able to gain 20 points over the years, that means that their base budget is now well over $60 million more than it would have been back at the beginning. I want to stress these are not the only ways in which these 6 institutions are managing affordability, but this is crucial because this is what makes a direct connection between having more quality and increasing affordability at the same time. The second group of initiatives in Georgia State's constellation of initiatives were organizational foundations. And what I mean by that phrase is things the organization can control about itself that are not teaching and learning, but that influence the kind of teaching and learning and student success that can happen at the institution. So one of the first things, and one of the more important things Georgia State did, was to begin integrating sources of data from all over the university, so that where previously you might have had to go to the physics department or the admissions department or the financial aid department to get information of a certain sort, now all this was flowing into a centralized integrated database that it made it possible to ask questions about, for example, how a particular slice of students were doing as they moved through their academic journeys. Students with certain entering test scores, students from certain ethnic groups or on financial aid, students who were in a particular meta major, students who then chose a particular major. You can just see along that particular pipeline what's happened to those students. That's not the only thing that can be done with this integrated database, but it's the most important one, arguably, because this is the information that then enabled Georgia State to target particular problems that were unnecessarily derailing large numbers of students and to fix those problems. The second of the two most important things they did was to create that Office of Student Success, jointly reporting to the provost and the president, with, over the years, increasing responsibilities for stimulating and coordinating and evaluating new initiatives that were designed to contribute to student success. As you may know, Georgia State was one of the early institutions into proactive advising, using large data sets about students and what had happened to them and how that linked to what they were doing, to provide proactive emails to students indicating that that there might be something that they need to alter. But actually, that's not all there is to it. The earlier successes, because this didn't come along until 8 years or so after this journey began, well, the earlier 8 years had increased revenue. Remember, I mentioned that $3 million plus for each point. Well, from that money, they drew funds to hire more academic advisors. Their goal being to have an advising system which was a benefit to all Georgia State students. At the beginning, the advising system was mostly used, that is, most of the advisors' time was taken up by the very best, most ambitious students, and by students who were so much in trouble that very often the advisors were being consulted too late to be of any real help. So they set up this sort of mainstream proactive advising process that involved both more people and also better information. And another organizational foundation change were financial aid reforms. Panther grants were given when the institution could see that a student was only lacking, $300, $500, whatever, which when added to the resources they already had, would enable them to handle the last semester, or sometimes the two last semesters of courses that they needed to graduate. Oddly enough, this has turned out to be a money-making program for the institution, because when you make a gift of a few $100s to a student, that may enable them and the people who are supplying their financial aid money to provide more money, enough to help them to graduate. So this program has historically run a surplus, with the students winning and the institution winning, or to put it another way, to providing more institution for the institution to help its students. The third and last family of initiatives in the Georgia State constellation are ways in which the institution interacts with its wider world. To put it another way, these are not things that Georgia State does by itself. It's doing it in interaction with some element of the world in which it's operating. So for example, accreditation requirements enable Georgia State to initiate, institutionalize, and assess some important new initiatives for its constellation. Georgia State has won a number of competitive prizes for its progress in improving student success, which have helped improve visibility and morale at the institution, the validation that, yes, we're doing something right, we're doing something good. Their progress has also enabled them to land some large grants to undertake new initiatives. The data warehousing reform started in this domain, more or less, because the president wanted the evidence that was going out of Georgia State to external entities like the state and accreditors and so on, federal regulators, that had to be validated and channeled through the central database, which meant that a lot of elements of Georgia State that had previously had the power to manage their own data by themselves and to make it available to the people they wanted it to be available to, now that was all flowing into the center. And that's made a lot of the rest of this possible. The College to Career program, which I mentioned as one of the more recent additions to the constellation, fits in here too, because it was meant to provide more ways for employers to engage with students, that is to sort of explain to students how what they were learning would be useful after they graduated. and for students to engage employers. So I really want to hammer home this point about threefold gains being important because it's so counterintuitive for most folks. Most of the account initiatives at your institution that are aimed often at a small scale, sometimes at a large scale, to improve quality or access or affordability. And I think you'll find that most of them have only one of those goals in mind, or sometimes two of them, but rarely all three. And that's a loss of an opportunity, because when initiative is devoted to just one or just two of them, it's easier to accomplish that if you sacrifice the third, whether or not you announce that's what's happening or not. And perhaps the most common one is our plans to improve quality and access will take a lot more money. So the state or donors or tuition payers will have to pay more in order for us to have this better education. Now, it's possible to have a better and more accessible education without making things more expensive. There's some other drivers of costs that are outside this realm. But in terms of teaching and learning, if you're working on quality and access and affordability, it's clear you need to change the fabric of a student's education rather than add on reforms at the margins where when resources dwindle, those are the first to fall away, or when their early champions turn their attention to other things, the earliest things to drop away. It's the initiatives that combine to improve quality, access, and affordability that are most likely to be sustainable, long-term, and less likely to be disrupted. So this is what it looks like. The constellation on the left has its three domains of educational strategies, organizational foundations, wider world interactions. They are aligned with each other, both within and across those three domains. So they're all trying to accomplish the same kinds of things, adding their efforts one to another rather than clashing and diminishing one another. And together they can improve quality, access, and affordability at the same time. If you haven't seen it yet, and I'll be showing this later for sure, but it appears in some slides in the margin. My email address is ehrmannsteve@gmail.com, ehrmannsteve@gmail.com. Please send me any questions or comments you've got now or later on. I do want to say one more thing about affordability, because it's probably been jangling around in your head anyway. It's politically risky to list affordability, especially if you use the word costs as a central goal. Of the 6 institutions, only one of them, the College for America at Southern New Hampshire University, was designed with affordability in mind. That is, they set a low tuition rate, comparatively low tuition rate, and then use that as a constraint on how teaching and learning can be organized. How can you have excellent, accessible, equitable teaching and learning, but only be paying that could be sustained with a comparatively low rate of tuition? That was the only one of the 6 that did that. There was another institution that was started from scratch, but its tuition was set by the system, City University of New York, in which it lived. But 2 other institutions of the 6, Georgia State and Central Florida, are both quite aware of the affordability gains that are side benefits of their quality and equity gains. And they talk about that. They provide data about that. They mention it in speeches and publications. Now, what interests me is that the other 3 have comparable constellations to the first 3, but they don't, and apparently haven't really looked into affordability gains that they're probably making without noticing it. And again, if you, since this obviously is not being done on Zoom, but is recorded on YouTube, if you'd like to talk more about affordability, airmansteve@gmail.com. Okay, I've spent a lot of time talking about Georgia State. Let me spend a little less time talking about the University of Central Oklahoma. What drove action? Well, there were really two main threads that I saw starting in the very late 90s and into the early 2000s. The first, that was the one that began in the late 90s, was a desire to make a University of Central Oklahoma education more distinctive. And initially the thought was leadership. And by the way, going back to constellations, leadership is still a strategic goal for a UCO education over 20 years later, going on towards 25 years later. Somewhat later, there were a number of conversations involving academic administrators and faculty on what's the goal, what's quality mean for this university. And after a number of meetings, and where people were being asked at this point to put their definitions on cards and hold them up, somebody held up a card that said, "Help students learn." And that was a pivotal moment for a significant number of people in the room who realized that it's very different to be talking about what we teach versus talking about what students actually learn. Not what they're supposed to learn, but what they actually learn. It's a real shift. Barr and Tagg call this a shift from the instruction paradigm to the learning paradigm. And if you want to know more about that, again, you can get in touch, or in my publications, including my book. I talk quite a lot, especially in the book, about this kind of paradigm shift that's going on. So meanwhile, with this, and then the sort of the final major step forward was the decision that University of Central Oklahoma education ought to be transformative for its graduates. And they were influenced by the ideas of Mesereau. In doing that was Mesereau. While all of this is going on, there's a second strand of activities which is completely unrelated to the first one, except that some of the same people were involved in both. This one was triggered because academic administrators in particular were noticing the sort of a growing aggregation of offices and programs, some academic, some administrative, some having to do with extracurricular programs, but they all somehow seem to have shared purposes. And the thought was, if we could become more explicit about what those purposes are, we could see where the holes are. So instead of having a gaggle, sort of a disorganized flock of things that we're doing, let's look at them in a conceptual framework that allows us to see what we're missing. And so they came up with 5 of what they call tenets, and you can read the slide. And then the two came together. We got transformative learning. Well, how do we transform our students before they graduate? Well, these 5 things are feeders into that transformation. Each, in fact, is a different dimension of the personal development and transformation of students. And they came up with a rubric to sort of describe generally the nature of this development, which would start with exposure. Then after further development, the student was judged to be, was supposed to have an integrated sense of things. And then finally made progress in this direction to the point where they've really been transformed. And transformation has a lot to do with the perspectives that people bring to what they see and what they do, the sense to which they've owned their learning in this area, and can begin to carry on their own, develop further in these directions. So you'll see that there are these three levels for each of the 5 tenets. And then, as the new president came in, one who had been in the early years of this transformation had been the provost. He'd gone away, had 2 other presidencies, and then came into his largest institution, and in some ways his home institution, Central Oklahoma, and decided we've got to start putting salt on the tail of this thing. We've got to operationalize it. If we're claiming that we're having students developing along these 5 dimensions, we've got to be able to provide evidence that the extent to which that is or isn't actually happening. And remember, this paradigm shift is from intentions to results, not away from intentions. They remain even more important than before, but to including results in your judgment of how well you're doing. So there would need to be some way of assessing this student learning. It would need to be voluntary, but attractive enough so that its use would spread from the early adopters, and that's what's been happening steadily. Parenthetically, I'll note that one of the things that was the biggest surprise for them was how transformational it was for faculty to read what students had written about assignments that were transformational along one of those 5 directions. Some faculty who had only seen their job in terms of content delivery and something that was limited to the limits of their course, we're now seeing that they were having an influence on student development in a larger way, and that was really exciting. And that excitement is part of what's helped this system to spread. The institution needed to develop the human capital and the procedures for doing all this. There would need to be routines where students would create something or an artifact and then a reflection, or sometimes just a reflection about experiences they'd had. They would self-assess, and then somebody needed to be in position to assess their assessment, to either validate, yes, I agree, you're now in this first or second or third stage of development. And if it was validated, then it needed to be in a database. So you could see across students where they were. It needed to be possible to download this into an ePortfolio that the student could use for different audiences and different purposes. Sometimes with only some of the information that would be, actually usually with only some of the information that would be in their broader student transformative learning record. You can think, by the way, of the disciplinary knowledge, that 6th tenet, that 6th dimension of learning, as being what the traditional transcript is about. Obviously, traditional transcripts are not terrific at doing this, but it's their purpose. And this transformative learning record, they pronounce it stellar, is about the rest of the student's development, or 5 important other dimensions of student development. So the university went after a Title III grant, got one on the 2nd try, and a major modification from first to second draft was they had to have a plan for how other institutions could benefit from these things that were going on developing at Central Oklahoma. They were already doing that, so it was not a big lift to come up with a plan to do it even more. They're working with another number of institutions around the world that are developing their own versions of this general approach. They have an annual conference on transformative learning. They have a journal, and they're doing other things as well. So I very briefly described 2 of the case histories. Here are the other 4. Each one of them was chosen because it shed a different light on this sort of emerging conceptual scheme for how an institution develops the capacity and uses that capacity to make threefold gains to improve quality and access and affordability. Governor's state is essentially using the LEAP model, if you're familiar with that, LEAP, Liberal Education, America's Promise, that emanated from AAC&U, American Association of Colleges and Universities. Gutman Community College, similar in some ways, but a little bit more focused in its assessment of how well it's doing by looking at retention and graduation rates in some similar ways to how Georgia State does it. I've mentioned College for America programs. They're competency-based and project-based, and they mostly are aimed at people who already have jobs and whose employer is sharing some of the costs so that they can develop themselves to do better in their work, to be more eligible for promotion and so on. Central Florida was fascinating and casts a very important light on the model, on this general framework, because of how well it's used fully online and blended learning spaces, in other words, courses and programs taught in such spaces, to magnify the university's threefold gains from that core strategy that all 6 of them are using, high impact practices, for example, and so on. The beginning of the book, there are 4 of these epigrams. I think you need to cope with the first 2. You come up with that, you go home to your institution or talking with colleagues and say, we should, do something like this threefold gain stuff, or I've got this particular initiative that might enable us to build on what we're already doing to come even closer to making threefold gains. And a number of people respond, well, it might be a great idea in principle, but we don't have the money. And anyway, no one really has the time to work out how to do that. This is both a feature and a bug of higher education. In the hundreds of institutions that I've visited and worked with, people are generally, they want to do well by their students. They want to do well by their mission. And because of those ambitions, free money doesn't stay free for long. Free time doesn't stay free for long. So, of course, if you approach somebody with a big idea, they're going to say, we don't have the money, no one has the time. But what you need to consider is that this process, for a variety of reasons, needs to go on slowly. So it's a matter of saying, we only have a little money and a little time this year, but intentionally we'll create more time and allocate more money next year, and intentionally the year after that, and so on, so that eventually the changes can be huge. A lot of the people I worked with dealt with information technology. And if you're anything like my age, you know what's happened to the budgets and organizational structures associated with information technology and its academic uses, which was a very marginal activity and very small budget 50 years ago, but has become enormous for most institutions now. And that was possible not in one giant leap, but in a number of small steps, with a growing conviction that such growth needed to continue. We've already tried that here and it doesn't work. I first heard that when I was a junior in college and paying attention to what was going on with a commission that was designed to rethink education at my university. There was the head of the Department of Electrical Engineering, and he would say that more than once in response to ideas about ways to improve MIT's education in the present. We already tried that in electrical engineering, it doesn't work, but that's fallacious. Innovations succeed or fail in ways heavily influenced by their context. That's in fact a major message of this talk. If you don't pay attention to context, not only will it be harder to do any individual innovation, most individual innovations, but it will seem to work less well than if it were in an institution or at a time where the context was significantly different. So just because electrical engineering had tried to implement a particular idea in a particular way in a particular year did not provide evidence that the university could therefore not find a way to succeed with that same idea, but implement it in a different context and at a different time. And you've got to embrace number 3 and 4. It takes a village. The 6 institutions I studied were unusually collaborative, cross silos, because they had in mind these existential gains virtually in what their institutions were able to do. Those high stakes meant that first, there was no one unit of the institution that could do it alone. It required presidential leadership sooner or later, and a widespread involvement of different components of the institution, not pursuing their individual agendas on their own, but pursuing as teammates the joint project, the shared project of, let's say, improving student success. All this may sound really complicated and a gajillion options. So conclude with the injunction from Dan Jenkins, who is speaking to other sports writers, know what to leave out. This is all about very carefully assembling a constellation of initiatives that in the end can enable the institution to make bigger and bigger gains on an institutional scale. And by the way, maybe it should be there as a fifth, the chances are, know it or not, that your institution has already started its journey towards making threefold gains. That is, it already has some elements of a constellation that are already in place. Some of them may be operating at scale, some of them may still be at a more boutique level. But to get started in thinking about this, it makes sense to begin by saying, what are we already doing right? What are we already doing that could become, when other initiatives were added, even more powerful as a way of accomplishing both that initiative's original purposes and also this larger scale improvement of quality and access and affordability. So that's the book. But there are also articles. The first one was published in Liberal Education. There's one coming up that'll be in PRISM, publication of the American Society for Engineering Education. There's one that'll be published in the next few months. And by the way, it's now late March 2022. That'll be published in the next few months in EDUCAUSE Review. That focuses on how technology can be used to amplify the effectiveness of this basic model for making threefold gains. If you want to buy the book, you can go through the publisher. There's a discount code. I don't know what the price is on the Amazon version, but that would also presumably be discounted to some degree. And if you want a Kindle as opposed to a different ebook format, Kindle's only available through Amazon. But I hope you will be in touch. There's my email again. And you can object, you can suggest, and you can query anything you want to talk about. As long as you don't want to talk about it for too long, I just enjoy doing it. It really energizes me. And anybody who can sort of learn enough what this is about to either tell me that it's worth doing and maybe even possible doing, or if they say, well, this, you think this is such a big deal, but I think it's woefully one-sided, impossible or trivial, or whatever you want to say, please let me know. And I think that's that. Thanks very much.